June 1999. NASA shuts down its computers for 21 days because someone has broken into their systems. Engineers scramble, security teams panic. Federal investigators race to trace the breach. And when they finally track the source, they're stunned to find it leads to a quiet suburban home in Pinecrest, Florida, and a 15-year-old kid. How did a high schooler outsmart America's most secure agencies? And why did his actions trigger a federal manhunt that would make him the youngest digital threat in US history? How does a kid go from hacking his school computer to triggering a national security crisis that reaches NASA, the Pentagon, and the highest levels of government? And more importantly, what pushed him to cross the one line that changed everything? What drove a teenager with no criminal record, no malicious intent, and no desire for money to become the first juvenile ever sent to federal prison for cybercrime? This is the story of Jonathan Joseph James, known online as C0M Raid. And what happened to him would change cybersecurity forever. Jonathan Joseph James was born on December 12, 1983, in Pinecrest, a middle-class suburb of Miami, Florida. His father worked as a computer programmer, and from an early age, Jonathan was surrounded by technology. By the time he was 6 years old, he was already tinkering with personal computers, taking them apart, figuring out how they worked, fascinated by what existed inside those machines. In middle school, he made the leap to Linux, a more advanced operating system that most adults couldn't navigate. He taught himself everything: Unix operating systems, the C programming language, network protocols. He read books, scoured online forums, and spent hours chatting with other hackers in underground communities. He adopted the alias C0M Raid, a nod to the camaraderie he felt with other digital explorers who shared his obsession. This was the late 1990s. The world was barely online. Dial-up modems screeched their way onto the internet. Corporate and government networks were built on outdated systems with weak security. Firewalls were rare. Intrusion detection barely existed. Most adults didn't understand how computers worked, let alone how to protect them. Kids like Jonathan, they had more access than anyone realized. They were exploring a digital frontier that had no rules, no boundaries, and no real consequences. Yet, cybercrime laws were primitive. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act existed, but prosecutions were rare. The government was asleep at the wheel, and teenagers with curiosity and skill could slip through cracks that shouldn't have existed in systems that were supposed to be secure. Jonathan wasn't hacking for money. He wasn't working for a foreign government. He wasn't trying to steal identities or destroy systems. He was curious. He described hacking as an intellectual sport, a mental challenge, an adrenaline rush. "It's power at your fingertips," he once said. The thrill came from breaching the barriers, from proving he could get in where others couldn't. But curiosity, when aimed at the wrong targets, can look an awful lot like terrorism. And Jonathan's curiosity was about to hit NASA, the Pentagon, and trigger a federal panic that would make headlines across the country. It started small, local, harmless, or so it seemed. Jonathan hacked his school, the Miami-Dade School District Network, and he got away with it. He discovered a simple vulnerability in the system, a backdoor left open by lazy security protocols. He logged in as an administrator, accessed student records, changed a grade here, tweaked an assignment there. No one suspected him. No alarms went off. No one even noticed. And in that moment, sitting in front of his computer screen, Jonathan realized something dangerous. If this was so easy, what else could I get into? That question, that single thought, lit the spark. Because once you breach one system, once you prove to yourself that the walls aren't as strong as everyone thinks they are, the temptation to test bigger walls becomes irresistible. Jonathan started scanning, searching, looking for the next challenge. Jonathan set his sights on Bell South, a major telecommunications giant. He scanned the internet for open entry points, systems with default passwords, outdated software, networks that hadn't been updated in years. And he found them. He slipped inside, undetected. No alarms, no alerts. He copied customer data, explored the network architecture, mapped out how the system worked. He wasn't there to cause damage. He was there to see if he could do it. to prove that even a massive corporation with millions of dollars in infrastructure could be breached by a kid working from his bedroom. And when he was done, he left. No trace, no footprint. No one at Bell South even knew he'd been there. But Jonathan knew, and that knowledge fed his confidence. If a kid could waltz into a telecom giant, what about the US government? This is where everything explodes. Jonathan targeted NASA, specifically the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, one of the agency's most critical facilities. He exploited vulnerabilities in their network, installed a packet sniffer to monitor data transmissions, and hijacked login credentials from unsuspecting employees. And then he found it. The prize. Source code for the International Space Station. Approximately 300 kilobytes of proprietary software valued at $1.7 million by NASA. This wasn't just any code. This was life support software, systems that controlled temperature, humidity, radiation levels, the environmental controls that kept astronauts alive in orbit. Jonathan downloaded it. All of it. NASA panicked. When they discovered the breach, they shut down their computers for 21 straight days to assess the damage, to figure out what had been stolen, to determine if their systems had been compromised further. The shutdown cost them $41,000 in lost productivity and repairs. Investigators had one mission: find the intruder. Find whoever had the audacity to break into NASA and steal code that could potentially endanger American lives in space. But Jonathan wasn't done. He went deeper, bolder, more reckless. Jonathan targeted the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the DTRA, a key arm of the US Department of Defense responsible for countering weapons of mass destruction. This was the Pentagon. This was supposed to be impenetrable. Firewalls, encryption, military-grade security. Except it wasn't. Jonathan installed a backdoor on a server in Dulles, Virginia. He deployed his sniffer program and let it run, quietly capturing everything that passed through. Over time, he intercepted more than 3,000 internal messages, usernames, passwords, nearly 2,000 login credentials belonging to military personnel, sensitive documents related to nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons threats, operational plans, emergency response protocols. He had access to some of the most classified information in the US military. Information that, in the wrong hands, could compromise national security. Information that could reveal how America defended itself against WMD threats. The Pentagon realized this wasn't just a hack. This was a potential act of cyber terrorism. And somewhere in the depths of the Department of Defense, alarm bells were ringing. Whoever was doing this, whoever had breached NASA and the Pentagon, had to be found, immediately. But Jonathan got comfortable, overconfident. He kept using the same backdoors, the same methods, the same patterns. He connected late at night from his home IP address, thinking he was untraceable, thinking he'd covered his tracks. He hadn't. The FBI, NASA, and the Department of Defense coordinated. They pooled resources, shared intelligence, traced the intrusions step by step. They followed the digital fingerprints, the timestamps, the access logs, the patterns of behavior that all pointed in one direction. And when they finally pinpointed the source, they couldn't believe it. A teenager's bedroom in Pinecrest, Florida. The greatest national security breach in recent memory, traced back to a 15-year-old kid. January 26, 2000. FBI agents, Department of Defense investigators, NASA officials, and local police descended on the James family home, guns drawn, warrants in hand. Parents confused and terrified, jolted awake by the sound of fists pounding on their door. They seized everything: computers, a Palm Pilot, CDs, hard drives, even unrelated items, books, notes, a Star Trek novel, anything that could contain evidence. Jonathan's room was torn apart, piece by piece, as agents combed through every corner looking for proof. And there, in the middle of it all, was Jonathan, 16 years old, shocked, terrified, handcuffed in his own home while his parents watched in disbelief. He was the culprit, the mastermind behind the NASA shutdown, the Pentagon breach, the nationwide investigation that had consumed federal resources for months. Jonathan cooperated. He admitted everything. He explained his methods, his motivations, his mindset. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He wasn't selling secrets. He wasn't working for a foreign power. He was just curious. He wanted to see if he could do it. He wanted to explore these systems, to understand how they worked. But curiosity, when it breaches NASA and the Pentagon, doesn't get you a pass. It gets you indicted. 6 months after the raid, Jonathan Joseph James was indicted. On September 23, 2000, in a Miami federal courtroom, he stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of juvenile delinquency under the Interstate Communications Act and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. If he'd been tried as an adult, he could have faced more than 10 years in federal prison. But because he was a juvenile, the court sentenced him to 7 months of house arrest, probation until his 18th birthday, a ban on recreational computer use, and mandatory apology letters to NASA and the Department of Defense. Attorney General Janet Reno made a public statement. She called the case a demonstration of the Justice Department's commitment to combating computer intrusions, regardless of the perpetrator's age. Prosecutor Guy A. Lewis called it a turning point for handling juvenile cyber offenses. But Jonathan didn't make it through probation. He violated the terms by testing positive for drug use. And because of that violation, he was sent to a federal correctional facility in Alabama for 6 months. He became the first juvenile in United States history to be incarcerated specifically for cybercrime. The media went wild. Headlines screamed, "Cyber terrorist," "Digital menace," "America's most dangerous kid with a keyboard." Some people saw him as a genius, a prodigy whose skills exposed catastrophic flaws in government security. Others feared what teenagers could now do, what kind of damage a single motivated kid could unleash from a bedroom. His case triggered new cybersecurity reforms. The government started taking cyber threats seriously. Agencies that had ignored warnings, that had relied on outdated systems and lazy protocols, suddenly realized they were vulnerable. Jonathan's hacks became a wake-up call, a harsh lesson in what happens when you underestimate the enemy. After his release, Jonathan tried to move on. He talked about starting a computer security company, about using his skills to help organizations patch the very vulnerabilities he had exposed. He criticized government systems for their lax security, argued that his hacks had served as warnings rather than threats. But his past never let him go. In 2007 and 2008, the Secret Service began investigating one of the largest data breaches in history. The TJX company's breach, which compromised tens of millions of credit and debit cards from retailers like TJ Maxx, DSW, and OfficeMax. The operation was led by Albert Gonzalez, a sophisticated hacker who had previously worked as a Secret Service informant. Jonathan's name came up. Court documents referenced an unindicted co-conspirator known as JJ, believed to be Jonathan James, who had allegedly helped a childhood friend, Christopher Scott, intercept credit card data outside a Miami OfficeMax in 2004. The accusation was that JJ had assisted in decrypting and forwarding stolen data to Gonzalez for resale, leading to the reissuance of about 200,000 cards. On May 18, 2008, Secret Service agents raided Jonathan's home again. They found an earlier suicide note, but they left his firearm unsecured, and just hours later, Jonathan James took his own life. In a 5-page note left for his family, Jonathan vehemently denied any involvement in the TJX breach. He wrote about fear of being scapegoated because of his infamous past, fear that no one would believe him, fear that the justice system would crush him again. "I have no faith in the justice system," he wrote. "Perhaps my actions today, and this letter, will send a stronger message to the public. Either way, I have lost control over this situation, and this is my only way to regain control." He had been battling depression for years, compounded by the death of his mother from breast cancer when he was just 18. The pressure of another investigation, the weight of his past, the certainty that he would be blamed regardless of the truth, it was too much. Jonathan Joseph James was 24 years old when he died. A kid who had once been celebrated as a prodigy, vilified as a terrorist, and ultimately remembered as a cautionary tale. His story exposes the intersection of youthful ingenuity, inadequate cybersecurity, and aggressive prosecution. It raises questions about how we treat juvenile offenders in the digital age, whether we punish them, rehabilitate them, or nurture their talents before curiosity turns into something darker. Some people see Jonathan as a villain who endangered national security. Others see him as a misunderstood genius whose exposures prompted necessary improvements in digital defenses. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. He wasn't evil. He wasn't a terrorist. He was a kid with extraordinary skills, reckless curiosity, and no understanding of the consequences. He showed the world that government systems were vulnerable, that teenagers could breach the Pentagon, that the future had arrived and no one was ready for it. And in the end, Jonathan James didn't set out to be a criminal. But in a world unprepared for the internet, even curiosity could look like a weapon. And once you're labeled a threat, once your name is in the system, once the FBI knows who you are, it never goes away. Somewhere out there, another kid is learning to code. Another teenager is scanning networks, testing boundaries, exploring the digital world with the same reckless curiosity that Jonathan had. And no one knows what door they'll open next.